Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Arizona. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1877. The Arizona Territory was still a rugged frontier, barely 3 years after the Apache Wars had subsided enough for settlers to stake their claims without constant fear of raids. Prescott, the territorial capital, was growing from a mining camp into a proper town, while Tucson to the south was already established as a commercial center. Between these outposts of civilization lay vast stretches of unforgiving desert, pine forests, and mountains where a person could vanish without a trace. It was in this harsh landscape, specifically in the small settlement of Hollow Creek, now absent from modern maps, that the Wilkinson Boardinghouse stood. According to territorial records from the Yavapai County Courthouse, the establishment was owned and operated by one Margaret Wilkinson, a widow who had traveled west from Pennsylvania in 1874. What makes this particular boarding house worthy of our attention isn't merely its existence in a forgotten ghost town, but rather what was discovered about it during a land survey conducted by the territorial government in 1889, and subsequently buried in records until a historian uncovered partial documentation in 1963. The Wilkinson boarding house advertised itself as a respectable establishment for gentlemen of means seeking comfortable lodging while conducting business in the territory. The building itself was constructed in 1875 using lumber hauled from the pine forests near Prescott. A rare photograph discovered in the personal effects of a land surveyor and dated August 1876 shows a two-story wooden structure with a wide front porch, ornate railings, and curtained windows that gave it an air of Eastern refinement incongruous with its frontier setting. A hand-painted sign visible in the photograph reads, "Wilkinson Boarding House, clean rooms, hot meals, reasonable rates." Yet, according to dispatches from U.S. Marshal Jedediah Harlow, at least 17 men who registered at the boarding house between March and December of 1877 were never seen again. This figure represents only those whose disappearances were eventually connected to the establishment. The true number may be higher. What follows is an account pieced together from territorial records, newspaper clippings from the Arizona Miner, personal correspondence found in a lockbox during the demolition of an old post office in 1952, and testimony given to a territorial judge whose name has been lost to time. The documents were microfilmed by the Historical Society of Arizona in 1964, but the originals were tragically lost during a fire at the Territorial Archives building in 1968. The Wilkinson boarding house stood 2 stories tall on the eastern edge of Hollow Creek, a settlement that existed primarily to service the nearby Redemption silver mine. The building was described in a sales deed as a wooden structure of 14 rooms with a dining hall, kitchen facilities, and a private quarters for the proprietress. What the deed failed to mention was the extensive root cellar beneath, which would later become central to the investigation. Hollow Creek itself was typical of many mining settlements that sprung up across the Arizona Territory in the 1870s. Initially nothing more than a cluster of tents and crude shelters, it gradually developed a main street with essential businesses, a general store, a smithy, 2 saloons, and a single-room schoolhouse that doubled as a church on Sundays. By 1877, the town's population fluctuated between 80 and 100 permanent residents, with an additional 30 to 50 transient miners, prospectors, and businessmen passing through at any given time. The Redemption Mine, located approximately 2 miles north of town in a steep-walled canyon, had been producing moderate amounts of silver since 1873. While not as rich as some of the more famous strikes, it was consistent enough to support the town and attract a steady stream of investors, engineers, and suppliers. These visitors constituted the primary clientele of the Wilkinson boarding house, which positioned itself as the only respectable accommodation in an otherwise rough settlement. The Arizona miner described her as a handsome woman of 40 years, with striking gray eyes and an air of refinement uncommon in these parts. A wanted poster issued in 1889, based on descriptions provided by Hollow Creek residents, depicts a woman with high cheekbones, thin lips set in a perpetual slight smile, and eyes that one witness described as penetrating enough to make a man forget himself. She presented herself as a widow whose husband, a Pennsylvania coal mine owner, had died, leaving her with sufficient means to start anew in the West. Margaret Wilkinson was known to the townspeople as a stern but fair businesswoman who had arrived with enough capital to purchase the abandoned trading post and convert it to a boarding house. No records confirming this background were ever found. She wore black exclusively, not in the manner of continuous mourning, but rather as a personal aesthetic that added to her air of mysterious sophistication. Multiple accounts mention her habit of wearing a single pearl pendant on a silver chain, described by one guest in a letter home as gleaming like a solitary tear against the black expanse of her dress. She employed two individuals, a cook named Chen Li, a Chinese immigrant who had previously worked in mining camps, and a handyman known only as Farley, described in town records as a mute Negro man of considerable strength and taciturn disposition. Chen Li was noted for his culinary skills, surprising guests with meals that far exceeded the usual frontier fare. According to an account by a traveling salesman who stayed at the boarding house in April 1877 and departed safely, the Chinaman's cooking would not be out of place in a fine San Francisco establishment, featuring delicately spiced stews and remarkable pastries that seem impossible given the remote location. Farley's background was even more obscure. No record exists of his arrival in Hollow Creek, and his muteness prevented him from sharing his own history. Town gossip recorded in a personal diary found in 1962 suggested he had been a slave in Louisiana before the Civil War and had suffered an injury that took his voice. His relationship with Mrs. Wilkinson was the subject of speculation, with some suggesting he was entirely dependent on her charity, while others hinted at a deeper connection. What multiple accounts agree upon is his unwavering loyalty and his ability to appear and disappear around the boarding house with unnerving silence despite his large frame. The first documented disappearance connected to the boarding house was that of Harold Pemberton, a mining investor from San Francisco. According to the guest register recovered during the 1889 investigation, Pemberton checked into the boarding house on March 12, 1877. He had informed associates in San Francisco that he would be evaluating silver claims for potential investment and expected to return within 3 weeks. Pemberton was described in correspondence as a methodical man of 53 years with a distinguished gray beard and gold-rimmed spectacles, carrying himself with the confidence of one accustomed to wealth. He reportedly arrived in Hollow Creek carrying substantial funds, estimated at over $5,000 in bank drafts and gold coin, with which to secure mining interests if he found them promising. A letter sent by his business partner to the sheriff of Yavapai County, dated May 2, 1877, inquired about Pemberton's whereabouts, stating he had failed to return or communicate. The sheriff's response, preserved in territorial records, simply stated that Pemberton had been seen boarding the eastbound stagecoach on March 17th, presumably headed toward Prescott. No further investigation was conducted at that time. Yet Stagecoach Company records examined during the 1889 investigation contained no entry for Pemberton on any eastbound journey during March 1877. More tellingly, bank records in San Francisco showed that none of Pemberton's drafts were ever cashed, nor did he access his accounts after his departure for Arizona. A diary entry by Hollow Creek's general store owner, Jacob Whitman, dated March 16, 1877, mentions Pemberton. The San Francisco investor visited the store today, purchasing writing paper and tobacco. He mentioned being quite impressed with the potential of the redemption vein and hinted he might extend his stay to examine additional claims. He spoke highly of Mrs. Wilkinson's establishment, noting particularly that she maintains standards of civilization that make the frontier tolerable for men of refinement. This is the last known record of Pemberton alive. Between March and July of 1877, the Wilkinson boarding-house guest register showed a steady stream of visitors, primarily businessmen connected to mining interests, land speculation, or merchants passing through. Margaret Wilkinson maintained meticulous records of each guest, including their stated business in the territory and their intended destination upon departure. These records would later prove crucial when cross-referenced with stagecoach manifests and bank transactions. One of the most revealing documents recovered was a leather-bound ledger discovered behind a false wall during renovations to the former Hollow Creek Assay Office in 1962. The ledger, believed to belong to Margaret Wilkinson herself, contained detailed inventories of personal effects organized by date, with monetary values assigned to each item. Of particular interest to investigators was the fact that many items listed, gold pocket watches, custom-made boots, monogrammed cufflinks, matched descriptions of possessions carried by men who had disappeared. An entry dated March 18, 1877, the day after Pemberton allegedly departed, reads, "Gold watch, American Waltham, monogrammed HP, $125, gold spectacles, $15, wallet with San Francisco bank drafts, $5,000 to be converted with caution. Pearl stick pin, $18. Boots, custom, cordwainer, Thomas of San Francisco, $35. A notation in the margin reads, "Larger items to be disposed of via F. Handle with extreme discretion." The respectable facade of the Wilkinson boarding house began to show cracks in late summer of 1877. According to a letter written by Hollow Creek's postmaster to his brother in Tucson, dated August 29, 1877, "There is something not right about the widow's place. Too many men check in and fewer check out. The stagecoach drivers say they've taken far fewer passengers eastward than the widow claims to have sent that way." I've mentioned my concerns to Sheriff Taylor, but he dismisses them, saying men often change their plans without notice in these parts. The postmaster, Elijah Montgomery, had reason to be suspicious. His position gave him unique insight into the communication patterns of the town. He noted that several individuals who had registered at the boarding house had received mail that remained uncollected, despite Mrs. Wilkinson's assurances that they had moved on. Montgomery began keeping a private tally of these discrepancies, but took no further action, perhaps out of fear or a reluctance to challenge the establishment without concrete evidence. Sheriff James Taylor's reluctance to investigate the discrepancies may have had an explanation beyond mere frontier indifference. Bank records from Prescott show that Taylor received 3 substantial deposits between April and September 1877, each following within days of a disappearance at the boarding house. When this connection was finally made by U.S. Marshal Harlow in 1889, Taylor was long gone, having reportedly moved to California in 1878 with what locals described as sudden wealth disproportionate to a lawman's salary. Taylor's complicity extended beyond mere financial benefit. Testimony given by a former deputy in 1889 revealed that Taylor had actively discouraged inquiries about missing persons connected to the boarding house. When a brother of one missing man arrived in Hollow Creek in June 1877 to investigate, Taylor allegedly told him, "Men come west to disappear, whether from debts, women troubles, or the law. Your brother wouldn't be the first to change his name and start fresh elsewhere. I suggest you respect his wishes and return east." The turning point came on October 3, 1877, when Edward Blackwood, a British geologist employed by a Denver mining consortium, arrived at the Wilkinson boarding house. Unlike previous guests, Blackwood kept a detailed journal of his travels and observations, which he mailed in sections to his employer. His final journal entries, recovered from the Denver Company's archives in 1957, provide the only first-hand account of the boarding house's inner workings. Blackwood was 38 years old, educated at Cambridge, and had spent the previous 5 years evaluating mining prospects throughout the American West. His employer described him as meticulous to a fault, with a scientist's eye for detail and a skepticism that borders on paranoia. These very qualities may have saved his observations for posterity, though they failed to save the man himself. Blackwood wrote on October 4th, "The Wilkinson establishment is clean and well-maintained, if austere. Mrs. Wilkinson runs a tight operation with the assistance of a Chinese cook who produces surprisingly palatable meals and a colored handyman who seems to materialize from shadows to perform tasks before disappearing again. There are currently 3 other guests, a land speculator from Chicago named Morris, a cattle buyer called Stevens, and a man who identifies himself only as Johnson, though I note he failed to sign the register upon arrival. His entry continues with observations about the physical structure. My room is on the 2nd floor, facing east. The furnishings are simple but of good quality. A bed with a surprisingly comfortable mattress, a writing desk, washstand, and a wardrobe of solid construction. The floors are bare wood, but well swept. The walls are thin enough that conversation can be heard from adjacent rooms, though not clearly enough to discern words unless voices are raised. A curious feature is the transient quality of the other guests. At dinner, Mrs. Wilkinson mentioned that she rarely has guests who stay longer than 3 nights, which seems unusual given the limited transportation options in this remote location. On October 6th, Blackwood's entry grows more observant. The walls of this establishment are curiously thin. Last night I was awakened by sounds of movement below my room, though Mrs. Wilkinson assured me at breakfast that I must have been dreaming, as everyone retires by 10 o'clock and the doors are locked. I noted that Morris, who occupied the room adjacent to mine, was absent from breakfast. Mrs. Wilkinson explained he had departed on the early stagecoach for Prescott. The entry continues, "I spent the day at the Redemption Mine, conducting tests on ore samples that I find promising but not exceptional. Upon returning to the boarding house, I observed Mrs. Wilkinson and Farley engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation at the edge of the property. This struck me as odd given Farley's supposed inability to speak. They separated abruptly upon noticing my approach. At dinner, Mrs. Wilkinson was unusually attentive, inquiring repeatedly about my plans and the extent of my company's interest in local mining operations. I deliberately understated our financial capacity, citing recent market contractions. Something in her manner makes me uneasy, though I cannot pinpoint the cause." Blackwood's October 7th entry reads, "Something is amiss here. Johnson and Stevens were both absent this morning. Mrs. Wilkinson claimed they, too, had departed early, yet I distinctly heard Stevens's voice well after midnight, followed by a thud and the sound of something heavy being dragged. When I inquired about the noise, Mrs. Wilkinson's demeanor changed perceptibly. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes grew cold as she suggested I must have extraordinary hearing to detect the pack rats that occasionally invade the walls." The entry continues with increasing paranoia. "I took dinner alone this evening, as no new guests have arrived. The Chinese cook served a stew of remarkable flavor, which Mrs. Wilkinson identified as venison with imported spices. I noted that Farley was absent from his usual post by the kitchen door. Mrs. Wilkinson explained he was tending to repairs in the root cellar. Later, while pretending to read in the parlor, I observed Mrs. Wilkinson entering figures in a ledger, which she quickly closed upon noticing my attention. There was a smear of something dark on her sleeve cuff, which she covered when she saw my gaze fix upon it." The final entry, dated October 8th, reveals Blackwood's growing alarm. "I am now convinced that foul play is occurring at this boarding house. This afternoon, while Mrs. Wilkinson was occupied with a new arrival, I observed Farley emerging from the root cellar carrying a familiar valise, unmistakably belonging to Stevens, who supposedly departed yesterday. When Farley saw me watching, he froze momentarily before continuing to Mrs. Wilkinson's private quarters. "I have arranged for the stagecoach to collect me tomorrow morning, claiming an urgent message requires my presence in Prescott. I shall alert the authorities upon my arrival. In the meantime, I have concealed this journal entry beneath a loose floorboard beneath my bed, separate from my regular journal, which remains in my bag. Should anything happen to me, let this serve as testimony." A postscript, written in a noticeably shakier hand, adds, 10 p.m. There are sounds from the cellar again. Footsteps in the hallway have passed my door 3 times in the past hour. I have barricaded the door with the wardrobe and shall remain awake throughout the night. I regret now not having brought my service revolver on this expedition, believing the Indian troubles to be largely resolved in this region. The danger, it seems, comes not from outside, but from within these very walls. Blackwood never boarded the stagecoach. The driver's manifest from October 9th shows no passengers collected from Hollow Creek that day. More significantly, Blackwood never returned to Denver, prompting his employer to eventually contact authorities. A cursory investigation was conducted, but like previous disappearances, it led nowhere at the time. What makes Blackwood's case particularly significant is that his hidden journal entry was eventually discovered in 1889, when the abandoned boarding house was being dismantled. This discovery prompted the first serious investigation into the disappearances, though by then Margaret Wilkinson, Farley, and Chen Li had long since vanished. The fate of Edward Blackwood was partially revealed during the 1889 investigation. When workers removed the floorboards in what had been his room, they discovered bloodstains on the support beams beneath, evidence that had remained hidden for 12 years. More telling was a broken signet ring found embedded in the dirt floor of one of the root cellar tunnels, later identified by the Denver Mining Company as belonging to Blackwood. The most disturbing discoveries came during the examination of the root cellar. What had appeared to be a simple storage space for preserving food extended far beyond its apparent dimensions. Workers removing the wooden flooring discovered a series of tunnels excavated into the earth, extending in several directions and connecting to multiple chambers, according to the U.S. Marshall's report, these chambers contained evidence of long-term human habitation under duress, including crude sleeping pallets, waste buckets, and restraining devices affixed to the walls. The tunnels themselves showed evidence of skilled construction, with support beams and rudimentary ventilation shafts that suggested they were designed for extended use rather than as a temporary holding facility. One chamber, larger than the others and located directly beneath Mrs. Wilkinson's private quarters, contained a wooden table with leather straps and a drainage system that fed into a deeper pit. The Marshal's report describes this room in clinical terms, but notes from one of the investigators, found in personal papers donated to the Arizona Historical Society in 1955, are more explicit. The chamber resembled nothing so much as a butcher's workspace, meticulously designed for the efficient processing of large animals, or in this case, human beings. More telling were the personal effects recovered from a hidden room behind Mrs. Wilkinson's private quarters. The room contained dozens of items belonging to missing men, watches, wallets, correspondence, and clothing, all meticulously inventoried in the ledger. Most disturbing was a collection of distinctive items, gold teeth, finger bones stripped of flesh, and hair samples, each carefully labeled with dates corresponding to disappearances. The collection suggested a trophy-taking impulse that went beyond mere financial gain. A territorial judge who viewed the evidence wrote in his private journal, "The precision with which these gruesome mementos were preserved and catalogued indicates a mind that took perverse satisfaction in maintaining a record of its deeds. Each item was wrapped in silk cloth and labeled with a date and initials. Some of the specimens showed signs of having been handled frequently, as though revisited for some unfathomable gratification. Financial records recovered from the Prescott Territorial Bank revealed that Margaret Wilkinson made substantial deposits throughout 1877, far exceeding what a legitimate boarding house in a mining settlement could reasonably generate. Between March and November, she deposited over $28,000, an enormous sum for the time equivalent to several $100,000 in today's currency. More revealing was the discovery that she had transferred the bulk of her funds to a bank in San Francisco in November 1877, shortly before abandoning the boarding house. The investigation extended to the two employees. Chen Li was eventually traced to San Francisco's Chinatown, where he was found dead in an apparent opium den in February 1878. The circumstances suggested murder rather than overdose, as the coroner's report noted, trauma inconsistent with self-infliction or accident. The timing, just 3 months after the abandonment of the boarding house, suggests he may have become a liability to his former employer. An interview with the proprietor of the establishment where Chen Li's body was discovered, conducted by a Pinkerton detective in 1879, revealed that Li had been living in apparent prosperity for several weeks, spending freely and speaking of plans to return to China. The night before his death, he was reportedly visited by a striking woman in black attire who spoke with him privately for some time. The proprietor recalled that Li appeared agitated after the conversation. His body was discovered the following morning with his throat cut in a manner that suggested professional execution rather than robbery or random violence. Farley was never located, though unconfirmed reports placed him in New Orleans in 1879. A dock worker there recalled a large mute Negro man who worked as a stevedore for several months before departing on a vessel bound for Brazil. Whether this was indeed Farley, and whether he was fleeing independently or still in Margaret Wilkinson's employ, remains unknown. As for Margaret Wilkinson herself, the trail grows increasingly complex. Records from the Pennsylvania town she claimed as her origin revealed no Margaret Wilkinson fitting her description or age. Further investigation uncovered a pattern of similar boarding houses operated briefly in Colorado, Nevada, and California between 1869 and 1874, each closing after suspicious disappearances, and each operated by women whose descriptions, while not identical, shared striking similarities. In Central City, Colorado, a Mrs. Margaret Wilson operated a boarding house from 1869 to 1871, catering primarily to successful miners and investors. After her departure, local authorities received inquiries about several men who had vanished after staying at her establishment, but no investigation was conducted at the time. In Virginia City, Nevada, from 1872 to 1873, a Mrs. Eleanor Wilkins ran a similar operation advertising accommodations for gentlemen of means. And in Bodie, California, during 1874, a Mrs. Elizabeth Willard briefly operated a boarding house before departing, suddenly following the disappearance of a prominent banker. A Pinkerton detective's report from 1883, commissioned by the family of one of the missing men, theorized that Margaret Wilkinson was an alias used by a woman named Eleanor Craft, who had been suspected of poisoning her husband in Illinois in 1868, but disappeared before an inquest could be completed. The report included testimony from a former acquaintance who claimed Eleanor had once remarked that men are worth more dead than alive, particularly those who travel with their wealth and without family connections to inquire after them. The report further suggested that Craft may have learned her methodology from a doctor with whom she had been romantically involved in Chicago. The physician, Dr. Samuel Blackburn, had been investigated for conducting unauthorized anatomical studies on unclaimed bodies from the city morgue, but was never formally charged. According to the Pinkerton investigator, Craft and Blackburn had planned to open a medical school together using illicitly obtained cadavers for instruction before a disagreement led to their separation. Whether Blackburn was aware of Craft's subsequent activities is unknown, but the precision evident in the Hollow Creek operation suggests some level of anatomical knowledge. The most credible final sighting of the woman believed to be Margaret Wilkinson comes from an 1881 report by a U.S. Marshal in New Orleans, who described interviewing a handsome widow of refined manner operating a respectable boarding house on Burgundy Street. The marshal had been following leads related to a series of disappearances in the area, but found no concrete evidence. The boarding house and its proprietress vanished shortly after his visit, with neighbors reporting that she had mentioned plans to travel to Europe. Passenger manifests from New Orleans show that a Mrs. Eleanor Winston booked passage on a steamship bound for Liverpool in June 1881. British records contain no further trace of her under that name, suggesting she may have adopted yet another identity upon arrival in Europe. What happened in the tunnels beneath the Wilkinson boarding house remains a matter of conjecture based on the limited physical evidence. The chambers showed signs of both imprisonment and systematic processing of human remains. A doctor consulted during the investigation noted that the arrangement of certain tools and the drainage system suggested a methodical approach to the dismemberment of bodies and disposal of blood and viscera. The absence of complete human remains at the site indicates a thorough disposal process. Local mining operations may have provided the perfect cover, as mine shafts and remote areas around Hollow Creek offered numerous locations where remains could be discarded without discovery. A search of abandoned mine workings in 1889 yielded fragmentary human bones in 2 locations, but they could not be definitively linked to the boarding house victims due to the degraded condition and the common occurrence of mining accidents in the area. The territorial judge who reviewed the evidence in 1889 wrote in his private correspondence, later donated to the Arizona Historical Society by his grandson in 1951, "I have presided over cases involving the worst elements of frontier society, from Apache raids to mining camp massacres, yet nothing has disturbed me as profoundly as the calculated evil evident in the Wilkinson case. That a woman of apparent refinement could meticulously document the conversion of human beings into inventory reveals a darkness beyond my comprehension." The judge's letter continues, "The most disturbing aspect is not merely the killing, but the system constructed around it, the selection of victims unlikely to be missed immediately, the corruption of local authority, the efficient disposal of remains, and the meticulous record-keeping that treated human lives as entries in a ledger. This was not the work of a deranged mind in the conventional sense, but rather a coldly rational enterprise that viewed murder as a business model. The full extent of Margaret Wilkinson's crimes remains unknown. The confirmed disappearances connected to the Hollow Creek boarding house number 17, but given her suspected operations in other locations under different names, the actual count may be significantly higher. A Pinkerton report suggests the total could exceed 40 victims across multiple territories and states. The motive appears primarily financial, yet the methodical collection of specific body parts suggests something beyond mere robbery. Dr. James Thornton, a physician who examined the evidence in 1889, speculated in his notes that the preservation of specific human remains indicates a ritualistic component or a collector's mentality that transcends practical concerns. These notes were filed with the Territorial Medical Examiner's Office and later referenced in an 1896 study of criminal psychology. The case of the Wilkinson boarding house faded from public awareness as the frontier era gave way to statehood and modernization. The settlement of Hollow Creek itself was abandoned by 1885 when the redemption mine played out. By the time the full investigation occurred in 1889, the site was already returning to desert. In 1952, when historian Franklin Mosley began researching disappeared mining investors for a book on frontier economics, he stumbled upon references to the case in territorial bank records. His subsequent investigation led to the recovery of scattered documents and the eventual connection of previously isolated reports into a coherent narrative. Mosley's notes from his initial discovery reveal his growing fascination with the case. What began as a footnote in my research into capital flow in mining communities has evolved into something far more disturbing. The pattern of disappearances connected to Wilkinson establishments across multiple territories suggests an organized criminal enterprise operating with impunity throughout the West for nearly a decade. That such activity could occur without coordinated investigation speaks to the fragmentary nature of frontier law enforcement and the ease with which predators could exploit the transient nature of Western society. Mosley's work was cut short by his death from heart failure in 1964, but his research notes were preserved by the University of Arizona. A graduate student named Catherine Lawson expanded on his findings for her doctoral dissertation in 1968, conducting the most comprehensive analysis of the case to date. Lawson's work included interviews with elderly residents of Prescott who recalled stories passed down about the butcher woman of Hollow Creek. One particularly valuable interview was with Thomas Jenkins, who in 1968 was 92 years old and had worked as a young man on the crew that dismantled the abandoned Boardinghouse in 1889. Jenkins recalled, "We thought it was just another tear-down job until we found the first tunnel. The marshal ordered us to keep digging, and with each chamber we uncovered, the men grew quieter. Some refused to continue working. I remember finding a pocket watch in the dirt and opening it to discover a photograph of a young woman inside. I've never forgotten the inscription, 'To Harold, with eternal devotion, Elizabeth.' Knowing that Elizabeth would never learn what happened to her Harold has haunted me all these years." Jenkins further recalled the atmosphere of the excavation. "It wasn't just what we found, it was the feeling of the place. Even after 12 years empty, those tunnels felt wrong. The air was stale and cold, and sound didn't carry right. Men who'd worked underground their whole lives, who weren't afraid of tight spaces or darkness, would emerge from those tunnels pale and shaking. I remember one fellow, a hard-bitten miner named McCarthy, who came up from the chamber with the table and simply walked away, leaving his tools behind. Said he'd rather starve than go back down there." The physical evidence from the case was collected by the territorial authorities and supposedly transferred to federal custody when Arizona achieved statehood in 1912. However, a fire at the storage facility in 1925 destroyed many early territorial records. What remains are scattered documents, second-hand accounts, and the foundation stones of the boarding house itself, still visible to those who know where to look in the overgrown remnants of Hollow Creek. In 1963, anthropologist Dr. Raymond Morrison led an archaeological survey of the Hollow Creek site as part of a broader study of abandoned mining settlements. His team excavated what remained of the root cellar and tunnels, finding additional evidence that had been overlooked in the original investigation, including a sealed mason jar containing human teeth embedded in the earthen wall of the deepest tunnel. Carbon dating performed on bone fragments recovered from the site confirmed they dated to the 1870s. Morrison's preliminary report noted, "The construction of the subterranean chambers indicates knowledge of mining techniques, suggesting either that Farley had previous experience in such work, or that Margaret Wilkinson may have employed miners temporarily for the excavation. The chambers are systematically arranged and show evidence of having been expanded over time, with the most distant tunnels appearing to be the most recent. This suggests the operation was intended to be long-term and was still in a phase of expansion when abandoned." Dr. Morrison's field notes describe the atmosphere at the excavation. "There is an undeniable heaviness to the air in these tunnels that cannot be attributed solely to poor ventilation. My team, composed of experienced field researchers accustomed to excavating grave sites and battle locations, uniformly reported sensations of acute discomfort while working in the subterranean chambers. 2 researchers requested reassignment after experiencing what they described as overwhelming dread while cataloging artifacts from the site." The final report from Morrison's excavation was submitted to the University of Arizona in 1964, but was never published. When journalist Michael Ferris attempted to access the document in 1967 for a series on frontier crimes, he was informed that the report had been restricted at Dr. Morrison's request. Morrison himself declined all interviews regarding the Hollow Creek site, and according to colleagues, abandoned his research into mining settlements entirely, instead focusing on Pueblo ceramics until his retirement. A colleague who worked with Morrison on the excavation, speaking on condition of anonymity in 1968, told Catherine Lawson, "Ray was never the same after Hollow Creek. He'd been in the field for 30 years, had worked burial sites from multiple cultures, but something about those tunnels affected him deeply. He became obsessed with certain artifacts, particularly a set of surgical instruments we found behind a false wall in what we believe to be Mrs. Wilkinson's bedroom. They were professional grade, the kind used in medical schools of the period, and showed evidence of extensive use. Ray would sit for hours examining them, then lock them away without documentation. Eventually, he removed them from the university collection entirely. When I asked him about it, he said some things should remain buried. What became of Margaret Wilkinson? The most compelling theory comes from a report filed by a Pinkerton operative in 1892 discovered in the agency's archives during a 1966 inventory. The report details an investigation into a prestigious women's boarding school in Boston operated by a Mrs. Eleanor Winston, a widow of exceptional refinement and education. The operative was investigating the disappearance of a wealthy student when he noted similarities between Winston and the description of the Hollow Creek suspect. The report states, Mrs. Winston maintains a select establishment for young ladies of good family, providing instruction in languages, music, and deportment. The school's reputation has grown rapidly since its founding 3 years ago, attracting daughters of prominent families from throughout New England. However, the disappearance of Miss Carolyn Astor, daughter of industrialist William Astor, has raised concerns about the institution's supervision practices. Mrs. Winston claims the girl left voluntarily to elope with a music teacher, but no evidence of such a teacher's employment can be verified, nor has any marriage record been located. The operative noted that Mrs. Winston bears a striking resemblance to the subject of the Arizona Territory investigation, allowing for the passage of 15 years. She speaks with a slight accent that she attributes to European education, wears exclusively black attire, and is noted for a pearl pendant worn at her throat. Most tellingly, she maintains a private collection of anatomical curiosities in a locked room, which she claims to use for instructional purposes in natural philosophy lessons. Before he could complete his investigation, the school closed abruptly, with Mrs. Winston citing family obligations abroad as her reason for departure. Passenger manifests show an Eleanor Winston booked passage to Liverpool in June 1892. British records contain no further trace of her under that name. A tantalizing footnote to this potential sighting comes from a British medical journal published in 1898, which mentions a Mrs. E. W., an American lady of independent means, who donated a substantial collection of anatomical specimens to a provincial medical college. The collection was noted for its unusual preservation techniques and the precision of the dissections. The donor's full name was not recorded, and attempts by later researchers to locate the collection have been unsuccessful. It may have been destroyed during the bombing of British cities in World War II, or perhaps incorporated into larger medical collections without attribution to its original source. The Wilkinson case represents a particular type of frontier predator, one who exploited the transient nature of Western society and the limited reach of law enforcement to operate with virtual impunity. The isolation of mining settlements, the frequent movement of people seeking fortune, and the relatively limited communication between jurisdictions created perfect conditions for someone like Margaret Wilkinson to prey upon the unwary. What distinguishes this case from many frontier crimes is the methodical, calculated nature of the operation. The Wilkinson boarding house wasn't simply a location where travelers were robbed. It was a carefully designed system for the selection, processing, and disposal of victims operated with business-like efficiency. The ledger entries, with their precise inventories and valuations, reveal a mind that viewed human beings as commodities to be broken down into their component parts. Sheriff Taylor's complicity adds another disturbing dimension to the case. His position as the sole representative of law enforcement in Hollow Creek allowed him to deflect inquiries, discourage investigations, and actively protect the operation in exchange for financial gain. The frontier's general acceptance of corruption and the limited oversight of territorial officials created conditions where such arrangements could flourish without detection. The particular targeting of men of means without close family connections in the area shows a predator's understanding of opportunity and risk. Mining investors, land speculators, and merchants were likely to carry substantial sums but travel alone. Their wealth made them attractive targets, while their transient status meant their disappearances might not be immediately noticed or vigorously investigated. The use of a respectable facade, a widow running a clean, well-maintained establishment with superior amenities, provided the perfect cover for the operation. In a frontier environment where rough conditions were the norm, the Wilkinson Boardinghouse represented an oasis of civilization that would naturally attract the type of clientele being targeted. The employment of Chen Li, whose cooking was repeatedly praised in accounts from survivors, served as an additional lure. Farley's role in the operation appears to have been central. His muteness, whether genuine or feigned, meant he could not easily betray the operation, while his physical strength would have been essential for the movement of victims and remains. The tunnels beneath the boarding house, with their careful construction and systematic layout, suggest significant labor that likely fell primarily to him. Whether he was a willing participant, coerced through dependency, or bound by some other tie to Margaret Wilkinson, remains one of the many unanswered questions of the case. The psychological aspects of the Wilkinson case have fascinated criminologists and historians since its discovery. The combination of financial motivation with trophy-taking behavior represents an unusual hybrid of criminal typologies. Modern analysts might classify Margaret Wilkinson as an organized, mission-oriented killer whose primary goal was financial gain, but whose methodical collection and preservation of body parts suggests additional psychological rewards from her activities. The ledger itself provides insights into her thinking. Each entry meticulously records not just the monetary value of items taken from victims, but includes notations about quality, condition, and distinguishing characteristics. Some entries include personal observations about the victims themselves. Subject J.M. displayed excessive fear, prolonged extraction necessary, or Subject H.P. maintained composure, valuable timepiece concealed in boot heel, thorough searches essential. In 1969, the last comprehensive analysis of the case was compiled by FBI Special Agent Robert Cranston as part of a historical study of serial crimes in the American West. Cranston concluded, "The Wilkinson case provides a rare documented instance of a female serial killer operating in the frontier era, employing methods that combined elements of the Black Widow archetype with the calculated efficiency more commonly associated with male killers. The meticulous record-keeping suggests a perpetrator who took pride in her work and viewed it as a business enterprise rather than being driven solely by psychological compulsion." Cranston's analysis continues. What makes this case particularly significant from a historical perspective is the mobility of the perpetrator and her apparent ability to adapt and evolve. The progression from the suspected poisoning of a single victim, her husband, to the sophisticated operation at Hollow Creek demonstrates increasing confidence and refinement of methodology over time. The subsequent transition to urban environments and possibly overseas indicates an understanding of law enforcement limitations and a sophisticated approach to evading capture. The site of Hollow Creek and the former boarding house lies on what is now private ranch land. In 1952, the landowner, disturbed by the history, bulldozed what remained of the foundations and filled in the excavated tunnels. Today, only a depression in the earth and scattered stones mark where the Wilkinson Boardinghouse once stood. In 1967, a Phoenix newspaper ran a feature on Arizona's Forgotten Horrors, which included a section on the Wilkinson case. Following publication, the landowner reported increased trespassing as curiosity seekers attempted to visit the site. His response was to further obscure the location, removing remaining foundation stones and altering the landscape to eliminate visible evidence of the settlement's existence. Nevertheless, the story persisted in local folklore. Residents of nearby communities passed down tales of the butcher woman or the widow who ate men. These folk versions often incorporated supernatural elements absent from the historical record, claiming Margaret Wilkinson was a witch who consumed her victims to maintain her youth, or that her ghost still haunts the site of Hollow Creek, luring male travelers to their doom. The academic interest in the case experienced a resurgence in the early 1960s, coinciding with the emerging field of criminal psychology and increased scholarly attention to frontier history beyond traditional narratives of westward expansion. Catherine Lawson's 1968 dissertation, Predation and Opportunity, Criminal Enterprise in the Arizona Territory, devoted a full chapter to the Wilkinson case, placing it within the broader context of frontier violence and economic exploitation. Lawson wrote, "The Wilkinson operation represents an inversion of traditional frontier predation patterns. Rather than the stereotypical male outlaw targeting stagecoaches, banks, or trains, highly visible crimes that provoked vigorous response from authorities. This was a female-directed enterprise that operated within social structures, exploiting assumptions about gender and respectability to remain invisible. That it could continue for so long speaks to the blindness of frontier society to certain forms of predation, particularly those that did not fit established patterns of criminal behavior." The last person known to have interviewed someone with first-hand knowledge of the case was journalist Elizabeth Harmon, who in 1962 spoke with Mabel Turner, then 103 years old. Turner had been a young woman living in Prescott when news of the Hollow Creek discoveries broke. According to Harmon's notes, Turner recalled, "People didn't want to talk about it much. It wasn't just the horror of what happened, though that was bad enough. It was the shame of knowing it had happened right under our noses, that the sheriff had been bought, that respectable people had dined with that woman while men were suffering beneath their feet. Some things are too dark to look at directly, so we pushed it away, like a bad dream." Turner also provided one of the few physical descriptions of Farley that goes beyond official records. "I saw him once in Prescott when Mrs. Wilkinson came to town on business. He was a mountain of a man, well over 6 feet tall and broad as a doorway, but he moved like he was trying not to be noticed. His eyes never left the widow, not in a disrespectful way, but like a dog watching its master for commands. There was something in his face that bothered me, though I couldn't say what. Not meanness, exactly, but a kind of emptiness. When she nodded at him, he helped her into the carriage with hands big enough to snap a person's neck, yet gentle as could be with her. It wasn't until years later, when the stories came out, that I remembered that day and felt cold all over thinking about those hands and what they'd done." The case generated renewed interest in 1964, when similarities were noted between the Hollow Creek operation and a series of disappearances connected to a Chicago residential hotel in the early 1890s. The hotel's proprietress, a Mrs. Eleanor Watson, was described in newspaper accounts as a handsome widow of distinguished bearing who maintained an establishment catering to businessmen of means. At least 7 guests vanished between 1891 and 1893, with their disappearances discovered only when the hotel closed suddenly and relatives came seeking information. By then, Mrs. Watson had vanished, leaving behind rooms that showed evidence of hasty departure. The Chicago Police Department, reviewing old case files in 1964 at the request of researchers, studying the Wilkinson case, discovered that the investigation had been abruptly terminated on orders from an unnamed senior official. This suggested a pattern of corruption similar to that employed in Hollow Creek, albeit in a more sophisticated urban environment. No conclusive link between the cases was ever established, but the timing, methodology, and target selection show striking parallels, and perhaps that is why the case of the Wilkinson Boardinghouse has never achieved the notoriety of other frontier crimes. It represents a type of calculated evil that defies the preferred narratives of Western history, neither a tale of lawmen versus outlaws, nor of conflict between settlers and Native Americans, but something more insidious, the monster hiding in plain sight, wearing the mask of respectability. The woman who called herself Margaret Wilkinson understood something fundamental about human nature and frontier society, that people see what they expect to see. A widow running a respectable boarding house was above suspicion, her comings and goings unremarkable, her business dealings presumed legitimate. This social invisibility, combined with strategic corruption of local law enforcement, created the perfect conditions for predation. The Wilkinson case also challenges gender assumptions about violent crime. As criminologist Dr. Helen Morrison noted in a 1968 review of historical female killers, the Hollow Creek operation defies traditional categorizations of female-perpetrated homicide, which typically involve poisoning, targets within domestic settings, or motivations of personal gain or revenge. The industrial scale, the selection of unrelated male victims, the physical nature of the killings, and the systematic processing of remains place this case outside established patterns and may explain why contemporary authorities failed to connect the disappearances to a female suspect until concrete evidence emerged. From scattered accounts of survivors, those who stayed at the boarding house but departed safely, a picture emerges of how Margaret Wilkinson selected her victims. Those who mentioned family waiting for them, who received regular correspondence, or who spoke of expectations of their return, seemed to pass through unharmed. It was the solitary travelers, those without connections, or those who boasted of carrying significant funds, who vanished without trace. A cattle buyer who stayed at the boarding house in May 1877 later recalled, "Mrs. Wilkinson was most attentive during dinner, inquiring about my business and travels. When I mentioned my wife and children waiting in Tucson, her interest seemed to wane noticeably. She turned her attention to another guest, a mining engineer traveling alone, asking him detailed questions about his work and how long he planned to remain in the territory. I thought nothing of it at the time, but when news of the discoveries emerged years later, I remembered that conversation with a chill, realizing how close I might have come to becoming another entry in her ledger." In the end, what makes the Wilkinson case so disturbing is not just the fate of her victims, terrible though that was. It is the reminder that the most dangerous predators are those who understand how to operate within the structures of society, using our assumptions and blind spots against us. The rugged individualism and limited accountability of frontier life simply made her work easier. Today, the site where Hollow Creek once stood is silent. The wind moves through sagebrush and across stone foundations that are slowly returning to the earth. Occasional visitors, usually historians or those drawn by the macabre history, report an unnatural stillness to the place. One researcher who visited in 1961 wrote, "Standing where the boarding house once stood, I was struck by the quality of silence. Not the usual desert quiet, but something that felt actively empty, as though the land itself were holding its breath." The fullest account of the Wilkinson boarding house and its horrors remains unpublished, locked in the special collections room of the University of Arizona Library. Dr. Ailes, Catherine Lawson's complete dissertation, including photographs of artifacts recovered from the site, can be viewed only with special permission, reportedly due to its potentially disturbing content and out of respect for the families of the victims. In her conclusion, Lawson writes, The Wilkinson case remains significant not merely as a historical curiosity or a macabre tale of frontier murder, but as a study in how societal expectations and institutional limitations create environments where predators can operate undetected. The very factors that made the western frontier a land of opportunity for honest settlers, limited governance, fluid identities, emphasis on self-reliance, and reduced social accountability, also made it fertile ground for those with darker intentions. Margaret Wilkinson understood these dynamics intuitively and exploited them with a precision that remains chilling nearly a century later. Perhaps it is fitting that the complete truth remains partially buried, like the ruins of Hollow Creek itself. The story of Margaret Wilkinson and her boarding house stands as a dark chapter in Western history, a reminder that not all frontier predators wore six guns or lived in mountain hideouts. Some served tea in respectable parlors while keeping meticulous accounts of their barbarism. And somewhere, in England perhaps, or further abroad, did an aging Margaret Wilkinson or Eleanor Craft, or whatever her true name might have been, sit in comfortable retirement funded by the wealth extracted from her victims? Did she maintain her ledgers until the end, a businesswoman to the last? Or did justice find her in some unrecorded form, far from the Arizona territory where her worst crimes were committed? These questions will likely remain unanswered. The last person who might have known the truth, Dr. Raymond Morrison, took whatever additional information he discovered at the Hollow Creek site to his grave when he passed away in 1968, having never published his findings or spoken publicly about what his excavation revealed. E.W., seeking consultation about a medical condition requiring discretion. The physician's notes describe his patient as an American widow of advancing years, but maintaining an aristocratic bearing, residing in Kensington, and claiming to have operated educational institutions both in America and on the continent. He further noted that she suffered from episodes of extreme agitation, during which she would speak of chambers beneath the earth and ledgers that must be maintained. The physician diagnosed her with neurasthenia, brought on by solitary living and possible past trauma, prescribing rest and mild sedatives. A curious postscript to the case emerged in 1965 when an elderly British physician donated a collection of personal papers to a London medical library. Among them was a letter dated 1903 from a Mrs. The most intriguing element of the physician's notes is his description of a pendant the woman wore, a single pearl on a silver chain which she touched repeatedly during our consultation, particularly when discussing her more disturbed episodes. Whether this woman was indeed Margaret Wilkinson is impossible to verify, but the coincidence is suggestive. All that remains now are fragments, scattered documents, second-hand accounts, and the silent testimony of a patch of Arizona desert, where, for one terrible year in 1877, travelers checked into a boarding house that was not what it seemed, and never checked out again. The case serves as a dark reminder of the shadows that existed alongside the much-celebrated light of Western expansion, how the same conditions that allowed for reinvention and opportunity also created perfect hunting grounds for those with murderous intent. In the vastness of the frontier, where a person could disappear without trace, Margaret Wilkinson created her own inverted microcosm, a place where disappearance was not chance but design, where the promise of shelter led to imprisonment, and where the comforts of civilization masked the most primitive form of predation. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case is how thoroughly Margaret Wilkinson understood her environment, not just the physical terrain, but the social and psychological landscape of the frontier. She recognized that in a world where men were the presumed predators, a woman would be overlooked. In a society that valued self-sufficiency and privacy, few questions would be asked about those who failed to reappear. In a system where law enforcement was limited and often corrupt, justice could be indefinitely delayed or denied. In this understanding lies the true horror of the Wilkinson boarding house, not merely what happened within its walls, but what it reveals about the darker currents that ran beneath the surface of frontier society, currents that occasionally broke through in cases like this, only to be quickly covered over and forgotten in the onward rush of progress, and the collective desire to remember the West as it should have been rather than as it sometimes was.